in Baku, the capital of Azerbaijan. Anatoly Karpov, Garry Kasparov, two chess giants, two irreconcilable rivals. Anatoly Karpov, 39, ex-world champion, who had kept the chess crown for 10 years until yielding it to Garry Kasparov in 85. A cold-blooded, prudent hunter for chess scalps, Karpov never forgives the slightest mistake. Garry Kasparov has been world champion for the past 5 years. His only rival is Karpov. Garry is fond of crazy, reckless attacks. When the smoke clears after battle, it becomes obvious that he calculated the combat down to the last move. On the threshold of a new millennium, mankind has begun to bow to reason rather than force. Perhaps this is the cause for chess champions being acclaimed the world over. But in the Soviet Union, chess champions have always been revered. The Soviet system, a record holder in military might, used a tiny army of brilliant chess players to prove its superiority in intellect too. Therefore, world chess champions have always been more than national heroes here. Maybe it was Lenin, a devoted chess player, who instilled that reverence for chess. Stalin, of course, worshipped every one of Lenin's pronouncements as divine foresight, reserving for himself the modest role of interpreting them on earth. The chess tournaments in the 30s were no less important than Republican or Democratic Party conventions. Mikhail Botvinnik was the first to snatch the laurels after World War II, and despite Stalin's imminent crusade against the Jews, was also the first to be showered with great privileges. Still, it was Anatoly Karpov who proved to be the most suitable champion for the system. In winning the chess crown, he seemed to pull out the fourth ace from a pack. The first three were already in hand. He was a Russian from the Urals, born into a common family and loyal to the regime. As a super gambler, Karpov instantly grasped the rules of the regime's political game. With the same pragmatism and consistency that he shows on the chessboard, Anatoly forced the leaders of the system, who proclaimed him principal Soviet sportsman, to give him benefits and awards incessantly. On becoming world champion in 1975, Karpov surreptitiously snatched also the Joker by returning the crown captured by Bobby Fischer back to the Soviet Union. For 10 years, Karpov would win all the tournaments running, but the fact that he had become a champion without moving a piece would be his eternal cross. Perhaps the genius Bobby was ruined by his own genius, but having refused to meet with Karpov, he gave to him not only the chess throne, but also an inferiority complex. While Karpov reigned supreme in Moscow, Garry Kasparov was born and bred in Baku, the capital of Azerbaijan, a Caucasian oil Klondike. The son of an Armenian and a Jew, he could reckon on the benevolence of the system only by demonstrating outstanding abilities. When Garry was 15, no one doubted that he was a future world champion. But to his misfortune, the crown belonged not only to Karpov, but to all the top nomenclatura. To reach his encounter with Karpov, Kasparov at the age of 20 enters the Communist Party and obtains an influential patron, Gaidar Aliyev, the overlord of Azerbaijan and a distinguished face in the Brezhnev entourage. But on the eve of the match with Karpov, Garry almost lost that royal patronage. He could now stake only on his own abilities and the support of his mother Clara, who till this day continues to be his confidential agent. Having taken the path of war, Garry could not imagine what a brilliant marksman he was facing. So the match between all-powerful Karpov and challenger Kasparov began in the early fall of 1984. According to the rules, it was not limited by a certain number of games and could end only after one of the players amassed 6 wins. There could be another end too, if one of the rivals failed to stand the tension and dropped dead. But neither happened. That super meet developed in the most fantastic way. After the first 3 weeks and 9 games, Kasparov was already losing 0-4. He, who had never seeded more than 1 to 2 matches a year. In the next 2.5 months, Garry defended himself like a knockdown boxer, drawing 17 games running. But the 27th game was Karpov's brilliant triumph. The score became 5-0. That was a rout. In a boxing ring, the referee would have opened the count. The shadow of Fischer, who had usually won straight, loomed behind Karpov's back. But even Bobby failed to stage such a massacre in the top finals. For the next 2 weeks, Gary was on the brink of defeat. But just when it seemed it was all over, Gary won. The match that started at the outset of autumn beat all the records of durability. It was not even interrupted for Christmas. A short break occurred only on New Year's Eve. The importance paid by the authorities to this match is clear from the venue, the Column Hall of the Trade Union's House, the most prestigious in the country. It was in this place that the nation mourned Lenin. At the side of the coffin of the inspirer of the Russian Revolution, Stalin swore to be loyal to socialism. It was here that the leader of all progressive mankind himself lay in state. Finally, 2 years before the match, the brief and yet pretty protracted history of military socialism came to an end with Brezhnev's funeral. Gorbachev was waiting in the wings, and only a short while remained until he would come to power. What you see now would never happen again. It was only in that first match that the irreconcilable rivals discussed the quality of their game. They talked as time went by. Twice the match was interrupted for the funeral of yet another member of the senile Politburo. With all respect for chess, the Column House could not be occupied for half a year by only chess and funerals. Besides, Gary had already managed to win another 2 games. With 48 games played, no one could predict the outcome. Florencio Campomanes, the president of the Chess Federation, was promptly summoned to Moscow. Having gathered foreign newsmen, he announced the Kremlin decision, which he still tries to pass for his own. He declared, "The match is closed without results. A new match will start with a score 0-0. That Solomon decision satisfied neither Karpov nor Kasparov. Moscow wasn't ready yet for public scandals between compatriots, more so in the presence of the Western press. The times of glasnost were only in the offing. There were still 4 weeks to go before Gorbachev's rise to power. Karpov argued rather politely but agreed. But what Kasparov did to counter the decision of Kremlin bureaucrats was a shock. In April 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev, not without difficulty, ascended the Kremlin throne. The country had long been ready for a new thinking, as the 54-year-old General Secretary called his policy. Had power gone to another Politburo veteran, he would hardly have limited himself to the Afghan war alone in a frantic attempt to delay the economic collapse in the country. When Gorbachev assumed his new office, he was still committed to communist ideals. Being the only Politburo member who realized in what disastrous direction his country was heading, he nevertheless considered that cosmetic repairs would do the trick. To air a flat occupying 1/6 of the planet's land, Gorbachev opened a window that he called glasnost. He also taught the world one more Russian word, perestroika. It was clear to many that the downfall of the communist ideals in the communist-most country was imminent, but outwardly nothing changed. This country is not used to quick change. In September 1985, Karpov and Kasparov faced each other in their second standoff at the Tchaikovsky Concert Hall, which at least was not the venue of funerals and most of all was used for Igor Moiseyev's dance troupe. While the first match had no time limits at all the succeeding ones were restricted to 24 games. Now it was clear when the second match would end. But how? The Soviets, who were accustomed to reading in between the lines of official statements, felt that their drowsy kingdom was fraught with great shifts. Chess, like the Politburo, had stopped being homogeneous. Now sympathies could be divided. Before the match, Kasparov gave an interview to West Germany's Der Spiegel. Outraged, the Central Committee began the process of disqualifying Gary for life for his open talk with the Western correspondent. Indeed, new times had come, as this process was never set going, though true, only a few persons knew about it. The second match was much more thrilling, with now Karpov, now Kasparov taking the lead. The last game was the decisive one. To take the crown, Karpov had to win, while Kasparov could do with a draw. It was the 72nd game, the last one in the record marathon. One incorrect move could become fatal for Karpov, as well as one move could crown Kasparov, and the latter made it. Spectators are fond of watching the demise of old champions, especially if more than half of the audience consists of spirited Caucasians, with the half of this half being Gary's friends and relatives. Kasparov's victory offended Moscow superiors. Only 3 months after the festive party, he was told to meet Karpov in a rematch. That was their third match in 6 months. All that Kasparov could do was postpone it from the spring to the end of the summer of 1986. But all that was yet to happen. In the meantime, at the age of 22, Kasparov becomes the youngest world champion in the history of chess. The incredible had happened. Karpov, who was habitually identified with the leaders of the former system, seemed like an eternal champion, like the system itself. The zest of the prize-awarding ceremony was that the laurels were presented to Kasparov by those very people who had done everything possible to rob him of them. The year is 1986, the second year of Gorbachev, the 6th year of Afghanistan. That bleeding wound of perestroika inherited by Gorbachev from his predecessors. Afghanistan, 15,000 Soviet soldiers killed, tens of thousands maimed. Afghanistan suffered a war in which it lost nearly 1 million of its own residents. A war that Brezhnev and his Politburo buddies conceived as a continuation of socialism in the East depraved a whole generation of Soviet youth with blood and arms. The Vietnam syndrome differs little from the Afghan one, but it is one thing when you have a sick people in a rich house and quite another when they are in a devastated one. Nobel Prize winner Dr. Andrei Sakharov, the father of the Soviet H-bomb, had been exiled to Gorky for protests against the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Gorbachev returned the Soviet propaganda-damned scientists to Moscow. That gesture could mean only one thing: the Soviets ultimately decided to bring down the curtain on the bloody Afghan scene. But let us return to August of 1986. We are in London. The rematch, which was highlighted by the presence of Margaret Thatcher, started in Regent Street, not far from Piccadilly, at the ballroom of the Park Lane Hotel. The Kasparov-Karpov duet was, however, more reminiscent of rope walkers' dance. Shortly before the third match, Kasparov declared, "I have the impression that I've committed myself to play all my life with Karpov." It wasn't far from the truth. The sharpness of their relations was at its peak. People associated with one of the two players were not accepted in the camp of the other one. Each of them claimed that the long vis-a-vis sessions had taught him to read his rival's thoughts. But apart from the spiritual side of these matches, there was a more pragmatic aspect as well. So let us talk about money. Perestroika could be felt even in chess. Having given up their staunch patriotism, the Soviets reserved the finals for Leningrad and ceded the first part of the match to London for a prize of almost $500,000. Previously, sportsmen only received a tiny part of their rewards, with almost all the money going to the budget of the Soviet Sports Committee. In the first and second matches, Karpov's and Kasparov's remuneration equaled 72,000 rubles, which even today, according to one of the official exchange rates, is not more than $12,000. The London prize for 12 games considerably exceeded the pace of the previous 72 games, but on the very eve of the match, disaster struck. Chernobyl. The Soviet Union had seemed to enter a run of bad luck with one accident after another. But none of them, even those in which thousands of people were killed, could be compared to the tragedy at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, where only 30 firemen died. Mankind will now live for decades with that invisible cancer tumor of radiation. The Grandmasters donated their prize to purchase Western drugs. The London half ended with Kasparov's 1-point superiority. During their flight, From Heathrow to Leningrad, Karpov and Kasparov played Belote. Gary was luckier, but unlike chess, that game involved no stakes. Luck, however, didn't leave Kasparov at the chessboard. Having won 2 more games, he relaxed somewhat prematurely. But the man who faced Gary had a 10-year experience as champion, not Gary's half-year title. Anatoly won the next 3 games straight. That was a record for any championship. The score drew. Karpov had proved that he was a great fighter if he had only won another game. But Kasparov's phenomenal combination became not only the highlight of the finale, but also the last point in that game. No revenge was taken. And though the whole affair created the impression that the pair was inseparable, all were tied, including Kapamanis. A pause followed. The year is 1987, the last unanimous Congress of Communists. The economic backbone of the state is cracking under the burden of military spending. This is obvious even to the most orthodox communists. President Reagan has learnt many Russian proverbs. Mutual condemnations have been forgotten. It has turned out that East and West can work hand in hand like good friends. This unexpected friendship ultimately caused Europe to embark on the elimination of medium-range missiles. The billions of dollars that for 4 decades were carefully hidden underground were dug up and after 2 signatures at the White House, smashed to shreds. After that, one may truly wonder whether man really is the highest reasoning creature on earth. In the autumn of 1987, the Soviet Union was marking the 70th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution in a festive and solemn atmosphere. The 4th match coincided with a parade in Red Square. Moreover, Karpov and Kasparov put their autographs close to each other day by day after every game, not only twice like Gorbachev and Reagan. There was one more difference. The mutual animosity between the 2 men did not diminish. Perestroika had reached such a level that the match was sold to the West from beginning to end for $1.5 million. This time the match was played in Spain. The Lopez de Vega Theatre in Seville had never seen a more boring performance. The end, however, saved the reputation of the 2 chess giants. After the endless, monotonous game, Karpov won in the last game but one. This time Kasparov seemed to be trapped. Could he repeat for the upteenth time his victory at the last moment? Still, fortune seemed to have chosen him forever. It was decided they square accounts the next time, 3 years later, in New York and Lyon. 3 years is not a long term, but those 3 years saw the birth of a new country on the site of the former Stalinist Byzantine Empire, and like everything new, it was a painful delivery. The collapse of the system can be compared to the death of Atlantis dropping into the oceanic deep. But Lord, why so many victims? The earthquake in Armenia, tens of thousands of deaths. Here, concrete houses collapsed like houses of cards. It killed children, whole schools of them. During classes, the earth gaped open. The celebrations of the millennium of the baptism of Rus were allowed. But could they remit the sins of 3 generations of the totalitarian regime? The heart of the righteous man failed. Dr. Sakharov was added to the list of the losses. Up to his last day, he battled for democracy. His life is a biblical example. No prophet is accepted in his own country. The Soviet army withdrew from Afghanistan. Dozens of generals remained without awards and trophies. And the Afghan army became a time bomb of perestroika. The tragedy in Georgia. One night, landing troops dispersed at Tbilisi demonstration with spades. That was a warning explosion. The night in Tbilisi made the army very unpopular. The night in Tbilisi enhanced Georgia's ambition to secede from Moscow. The night in Tbilisi is the last tragedy in Sakharov's life. Ethnic unrest shook the country, which just a while before had marveled at its own ethnic policy. Kasparov is on the embankment of his native Baku. He will never return here again. During Armenian pogroms, he saved himself and his relatives by sheer miracle, fleeing the bleeding city on board a chartered plane. Disappointed in the state ideology, Kasparov drops out of the Communist Party and contributes to the establishment of the Democratic Russia Party, rejecting Marxism-Leninism. Karpov hasn't taken such radical steps. He was elected People's Deputy of the USSR and sits at Kremlin sessions, something like a congressman in the United States. When a group of American senators presented Mikhail Gorbachev with a piece of the Capitolian wall, he said, "It's time to gather stones." The time has really come, and in it, Gorbachev is the new Messiah professing life without wars. But the war between these two men is still not over.